Then he leaned down, his lips finding hers, the lips that had belonged to him in his restless dreams. The kiss was gentle but full of longing, as if the two were trying to make up for all the lost days. Ariana's lips, soft, carried a sweet aftertaste mixed with bitterness. She responded to him without inhibition, as if it were possible. All the barriers between them had been erased by time. Welcome to Secrets of the Night. If you love emotional and engaging love stories, then come to our channel. Here, we will bring you stories full of surprises, touching and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any interesting stories. In today's video, we would like to present to you a story called Mrs. Ariana, Nostalgic by the Banana Bush, narrated by Jane. Please watch along. On summer days, the scorching sun covers the countryside, making everything seem to be baked under the sun. The wind blows through the space as if it were thickening. The cicadas chirp painfully from the old banyan and bamboo trees on the side of the road, making the air even more sultry. On the bumpy red dirt road, tiny dust particles fly up with every step. By the rice field, next to the large fish pond, Mrs. Ariana squats and bends down, cutting each clump of rice grass. Her old brown shirt has frayed edges from the sun and wind, sticking to her body because of the sweat that flows continuously. Drops of sweat appear on her eyebrows and slide down her cheeks, wetting her entire face. Mrs. Ariana stops for a moment, looking up at the clear blue sky above. The sun is harsh and merciless. The plants on both sides of the rice field are dry, curling up under the scorching heat. She sighed, her deep eyes revealing fatigue, not only because of the sweltering summer sun, but also because of the invisible pain that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Deep down, she knew she was no longer the young girl of 15 years ago. The years of taking care of the family, along with the burdens of the harvest and her husband's illness, had worn away her youth. The face that was once full of life here was covered with a layer of fatigue, but somewhere there was still a trace of sadness. Since her husband, Mr. Anthony, had an accident and was paralyzed, all the big and small tasks in the family had fallen to her. The small, cramped 3-room wooden house always smelled of medicine and Mr. Anthony's weak cough. During the long nights, she lay beside him, listening to his heavy breathing, her heart filled with indescribable sadness. The man who had once been her support was now just a weak, useless figure. She had tried many times to bury her feelings, telling herself that the love between husband and wife was more precious than anything else, but over time her heart had become heavy. Every time she looked at Mr. Anthony lying motionless, she felt both pity and sadness. There were long, sleepless nights. She could only look up at the roof and think about the future, old age on the other side. The fish pond was not far from her field. Mr. Archer was sitting under an old elm tree, waving a palm leaf fan. He was paying close attention to Mrs. Ariana's every move. This pond was his entire fortune, where he raised fish to sell to the district market, and where he had lived since his wife passed away. Mr. Archer was nearly 60 years old this year, tall and slim, but had begun to lose weight over the years. His face was dotted with sun and wind. Since Mr. Anthony's illness, Mr. Archer had begun to pay more attention to Mrs. Ariana. At first, it was just a fleeting glance every time she went to work in the field, but gradually he felt his attention to her increase. He was attracted by the diligence and beauty emanating from that woman, a woman who, despite her hardships, still maintained a simple, gentle appearance. And most of all, it was the lack of affection that Mr. Archer, with the instinct of an experienced man, easily recognized. The summer sun was getting hotter and hotter. The ground seemed to evaporate, creating a hot steam on Mrs. Ariana's face. Her hands became slow, her breathing became more rapid. Her head was spinning, and then her legs no longer had enough strength. From afar, Mr. Archer saw Mrs. Ariana staggering. He quickly put down his palm fan and ran across the dirt road, quickly coming to her side. "Mrs. Ariana, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Mr. Archer put his hand under her back and lifted her up. "Under the sun, Mrs." Ariana, sweating, lay still in his arms, her face pale, her breathing weak. Mr. Archer looked around, leading her back to the fish hut where he slept. The hut was close to the edge of the pond, nestled between the dense bamboo groves. The light coming through the door fell on the old bamboo bed. Mr. Archer gently put Ariana down on the bed. He gently wiped her face. His calloused hands moved slowly over Ariana's warm skin, his heart fluttering under his fingers. How long had it been since he had been so close to a woman? Mrs. Ariana, turning slightly, opened her eyes and looked around dreamily. When she saw Mr. Archer, she was a little startled but quickly realized her situation. "What's wrong with you?" she asked weakly. "She fainted in the field. I saw her and brought her here," Mr. Archer replied, his voice still a little confused. Mrs. Ariana nodded gently, her eyes closed. At this moment she felt a strange and familiar feeling, being cared for, and in the quiet of the small hut, her heart was gently stirred. The space in the small pond hut became silent. Only the sound of the pond water gently lapping at the banks, mixed with the rustling of bamboo leaves when the wind gently blew by. After wiping Mrs. Ariana's face, Mr. Archer sat quietly watching. A complex feeling rose in her heart, both sympathy and longing, mixed with a hint of calculation. Mrs. Ariana lying on the bamboo bed, her breathing was even, but her face was still tired. Mr. Archer noticed her thin, bare shoulders exposed under her silver-brown shirt, the collar slightly open to reveal her pale white skin. He silently swallowed his saliva. An indescribable feeling arose in his heart. It had been a long time since he had been close to a woman. As for Mrs. Ariana, at this moment, in his eyes, she was not only a pitiful woman, but also an irresistible temptation. When Mrs. Ariana woke up, their eyes met. Mrs. Ariana kept feeling that something was wrong in Mr. Archer's gaze, but she remained silent, not knowing what to say. "Are you better?" Mr. Archer's voice was deep and kind. Mrs. Ariana nodded slightly, trying to sit up, but the fatigue still weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Thank you. I feel better." Mr. Archer reached out to help her up, deliberately touching her hand. Mrs. Ariana drew back but said nothing. Something very confusing was happening. An unexpected closeness made her feel confused. "Sit down a little longer, it's still very sunny. It's not good to go out at this time," Mr. Archer said softly, but his eyes did not leave hers. Mrs. Ariana silent, his concern made her both grateful and elated. It had been a long time since anyone had treated her like that. No one had looked at her with such eyes. Her heart began to tremble, even though she knew she shouldn't. Old memories flooded back into Ariana's mind. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when Anthony was still healthy. When Anthony was healthy, he was a tough man, but also very loving. They used to spend long nights sitting under a tree, holding hands and looking at the stars, talking about their dreams and hopes. But as time passed, work and family pressures gradually drifted apart. When Anthony had a stroke, everything seemed to calm down. Ariana, used to working, kept her feelings to herself. But today, when being cared for by Mr. Archer, she vaguely felt a long-forgotten desire awakening. It was not only an emotional need, but also a mental anguish, wanting to become a real woman again, to be loved, to be caressed, to be cared for. "It's hard at home, isn't it?" Mr. Archer began the story, trying to reduce Mrs. Ariana's stress. She gently replied, "I'm used to it. Everything is in my hands, but what can I do? My husband is too weak to help anymore." Mr. Archer sighed, his eyes still fixed on her. "You really have a hard time. It's so hard for a woman to have to bear everything." He was silent for a moment, then smiled gently. "If it were me, I wouldn't let you suffer." Mr. Archer's casual but suggestive words made Mrs. Ariana slightly startled. She looked at him, about to say something, but then fell silent. There was something in Mr. Archer's eyes that made her both nervous and afraid. The sunlight outside the hut had softened, but the atmosphere inside was still tense. Mrs. Ariana felt her heart beating faster than usual. There was something dangerous in the way Mr. Archer looked at her, but at the same time it made her feel alive again. "Let's go home before it's too late, Mrs." Ariana tried to stand up, but Mr. Archer reached out and took her hand, gently but firmly. "Let me take you home." His voice was warm, like an invitation that was difficult to refuse. Mrs. Ariana tilted her head. "No need, I can go by myself." Mr. Archer said nothing more, but his eyes said it all. Mrs. Ariana stepping out of the hut, her heart was heavy with emotions. On the way home, her steps were heavy. She had taken the first steps into a trap, whose consequences she did not foresee. Ever since she fainted and was taken to the hut by Mr. Archer, Mrs. Ariana's mind had been restless. No matter how hard she tried to push away the images and feelings of him, they still crept into her every thought. "Great. You have written a very detailed description of the character's psychology and the development of the story. To make the story more perfect, I would like to edit some minor spelling and grammar errors. The paragraph after correction. Every time she went to the fields, she couldn't help but look towards Mr. Archer's fish pond. That man's familiar, sleek appearance? Mr. Archer must have known the wavering in Mrs. Ariana's heart. From today on, he tried to appear more often at the pond's edge, always keeping a distance far enough to not be noticed, but close enough for Mrs. Ariana to know that he was watching. Every time she met his eyes, Mrs. Ariana lowered her head, but sometimes she still couldn't help but smile. In Mrs. Ariana's heart, there was a fierce battle between her mind and her emotions. Part of her knew she shouldn't continue like this, but the other part couldn't resist Mr. Archer's attraction, a caring attention that she had longed for so many years. That afternoon, Mrs. Ariana returned home. The small house lay still in the fading sunset. Inside, Mr. Anthony lay motionless on the bed, his eyes dimly looking out the window. He had not been able to speak much since his illness, only able to make weak hums when he needed something. Mrs. Ariana went into the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner for two. Just a few bowls of white rice with a few stalks of vegetables and a plate of salty braised fish. But for a woman who had to take care of everything, that was already an effort to overcome. In that small house, she worked hard with her thin hands. Her eyes turned towards the main house where her husband still lay motionless. When she brought the bowl of rice to her husband, she saw him looking at her with eyes filled with helplessness and sadness. She did not know if he understood that she was gradually drifting apart, but this feeling flashed through her heart. With a sweet heart, she sat down next to him, helping him eat each spoonful of rice, but the silence between them weighed her down even more. "I tried so hard," she whispered softly in her heart, but it probably couldn't ease the growing unease in her heart. The next day, Mrs. Ariana went to the field earlier than usual. She thought that if she avoided Mr. Archer, all her feelings would soon cool down and she could return to her previous peaceful life. But fate did not want to let her go. As she was bending under the early morning sun, Mr. Archer's tall figure appeared on the other side of the field. He walked quickly. On his shoulder was a bamboo box. Inside were a few perch that had just been caught from the pond. "Mrs. Ariana, why are you going to the field so early this morning, Mr.?" Archer smiled brightly. His eyes lit up when he saw her. Mrs. Ariana, a little surprised, tried to keep calm. Yes, I'll finish early. The sun is tiring. Mr. Archer put down the basket of fish and sat down on the bank next to her. Why didn't I see you come to the pond yesterday? I caught a lot of fish. I was going to give you some to take home, but I didn't see you. Mrs. Ariana, blushing slightly, lowered her head to look at the newly planted rice field, not knowing how to answer. Her heart was in turmoil, and there was something in Mr. Archer's words, she thought, that was gentle and tactful, that made her both want to avoid and long to respond. Take them home for someone else. I don't lack fish, said Mrs. Ariana firmly. Mr. Archer smiled. You are too kind. It is only fish. If you do not marry me, I will be sad. Mrs. Ariana did not answer, just bowed her head and continued working. But her heart was in turmoil. The scent of the fragrant fields and the scent of Mr. Archer's body made her dizzy. How long had it been since she felt the close presence of a man like this? All that day, Mrs. Ariana, working with a mind full of thoughts. Mr. Archer's words haunted her. She could not deny that she liked the feeling of his attention, even if it was just a random sentence or the eyes that followed her every time she passed the pond. But she also knew that if she continued on this path, there would be no turning back. When she got home, she found herself back in reality. Mr. Anthony was still lying there, saying nothing, doing nothing, just a living body that had lost all will. She looked at her husband, her heart filled with an indescribable sadness. Perhaps if Mr. Anthony were still healthy, she would not feel so lonely. At night, she lay awake in bed. Mr. Archer's shadow, his smile, his voice lingered in her mind. Part of her wanted to stop, to return to normal life, but the other part could not calm the tense emotions that had just been awakened. That night, when everything had fallen silent, Mrs. Ariana heard a soft noise in the yard. She sat up, thinking that it must be a cat or a dog running by. But no, it was a knock on the door, very soft but loud enough for her to hear. Mrs. Ariana, Mr. Archer whispered outside the door. Her heart was pounding as if it wanted to jump out of her chest. Her name called in the quiet night, carrying with it a strange feeling. She sat up, her limbs trembling. In that moment, she knew that if she opened the door, she would step into a storm of emotions she could not control. But if she did not open it, would she be able to contain her emotions for the rest of her life? Mrs. Ariana, standing in front of the wooden door, her hand ran lightly to the door latch. But at that very moment, the burning desire to be close, to escape the vicious circle of loneliness, Mrs. Ariana, open the door. Mr. Archer's voice rang out softly but with an urgency. Quiet, turn on the light, open the door. She saw Mr. Archer standing there, tall and tall, his eyes shining in the dim moonlight. The wind blew through the yard, carrying the pungent scent of the pond and the still damp soil. Mrs. Ariana, standing behind the door, felt as if she were stepping into a forbidden land, a place where no one had ever set foot. Mrs. Ariana spoke softly. You shouldn't have come here. Mr. Archer gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Don't worry, no one will know. Mr. Anthony is asleep, isn't he? Mrs. Ariana did not answer, but her bewildered eyes were enough for Mr. Archer to understand. He gently pulled her into his arms, a hug that was just enough for her to not resist. Mrs. Ariana, trembling but not pushing him away, the feeling of being placed against a strong man after so many years made Mrs. Ariana know she should stop, but her hands were no longer rational. She let herself sink into Mr. Archer's arms, feeling his strong heartbeat. In that moment, she seemed to forget everything, forget the weak husband in the room, forget the gossip outside, forget the moral principles she had kept for so many years. The two stood side by side in the darkness, their breaths mingling, the long-suppressed passions bursting out, sweeping both of them into an emotion that neither could resist. "Just a moment, I promise I won't bother you for long," he said softly. Mrs. Ariana, not answering, only knew silence. As both were immersed in the moment of passion, a gentle noise from her husband's room made Mrs. Ariana startled. Time seemed to stop for a moment. "It's my husband," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Mr. Archer immediately released her, and they both held their breaths, listening. A muffled sound came from the room where Mr. Anthony lay. Perhaps he had woken up, or sensed something suspicious. Mrs. Ariana, hastily pushing Mr. Archer toward the door. "You go, he can't see." Mr. Archer understood the danger of the matter. With the quickness of a man of experience, the old man passed through the door, turned his head, smiled slightly. "See you tomorrow," and disappeared into the darkness. Mrs. Ariana, closing the door, leaned against the wall, trembling with fear. A feeling of satisfaction and wrongness surrounded her like an invisible thread. She walked quickly into the room, saw her husband stirring on the bed, his cloudy eyes trying to turn toward her. Mrs. Ariana, sitting down on the bed, took his hand. "It's me, it's nothing, go to sleep." His hand moved slightly in hers, as if he wanted to say something, but then he just sighed and turned his face to the wall. The next day, Mrs. Ariana woke up early, feeling uneasy. Even though Mr. Archer had left during the night, she could still see his shadow lurking in every corner of the house. She told herself that she would never see him again, that everything would stop there. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. When she reached the field, Mrs. Ariana felt her heart lighten. The clear morning sky and the chirping of birds in the trees gave her a rare sense of peace. But the peace did not last long. Mr. Archer's shadow appeared again, this time at the edge of the pond. He sat leaning against a tree, fishing rod in hand, smiling when he saw her coming. "Hello, Mrs. Ariana. You went to the field early this morning." Mrs. Ariana paused and reluctantly stepped forward. "Mr. Archer, don't come near me any more." Mr. Archer just smiled meaningfully. "I didn't do anything. We're just neighbours caring for each other. You shouldn't do that." Mrs. Ariana was silent, but inside, mixed feelings arose again. Mr. Archer's eyes made her feel like a prey being hunted, both scared and excited. "Look here," Mr. Archer said softly, lowering his voice. "If you don't want to see me any more, I'll go, but—" He paused, his cold eyes fixed on her. "What happened last night? I'll keep it a secret between us." Mrs. Ariana felt her whole body go cold. Mr. Archer was threatening her. If she didn't do him a favour, would he tell anyone about it? The gossip in the village wouldn't leave her alone, and if her husband found out, he wouldn't be able to bear the shock. "Don't say anything to anyone," Mrs. Ariana pleaded softly, her eyes full of pleading. Mr. Archer smiled contentedly. "Don't worry, I'm not a cruel person, but I hope you won't leave me. Sometimes life needs a little fun, doesn't it?" Mrs. Ariana, silent, her heart was in turmoil. She knew that she had stepped into a trap, a sweet but dangerous trap, and now she had no way out. After Mr. Archer's threat, Mrs. Ariana's mind fell into a whirlpool of confusion. His gentle but meaningful words echoed in her head. "If you don't want to see me again, I will go. But last night—" Mrs. Ariana knew that she had made a big mistake, a mistake that, if discovered, would have unforeseeable consequences. But the more she tried to stop, the more her heart was filled with indescribable longing. The feeling of being cared for by Mr. Archer had awakened desires that she thought had long since died. Every night when she lay down, Ariana felt her heart being torn in two. Mr. Anthony, the man who had been the pillar of her life, was now just a weak shadow. His gasps, his mumbling calls of her name in the middle of the night made her both sympathetic and desperate. There were nights when she lay awake, her eyes wide open, looking up at the old roof, her thoughts in turmoil. she wondered. What have I done? I have betrayed my husband here. The man who had been with her through so many storms. But then, every time Mr. Archer's gentle eyes appeared in her memory, her heart softened. She remembered every caress, every warm hug from him. Those were the moments she had longed for so many years, the feelings that Mr. Anthony could no longer give her. The inner torment made Mrs. Ariana promise herself that she would stop, but every time she passed Mr. Archer's fish pond, she could not stop herself. Just one look from him, one gentle word, she seemed to be pulled into the vortex of passion. One afternoon, after her husband had finished feeding Mr. Anthony, Mrs. Ariana left the house. The afternoon shadows were long on the quiet village road. Her heart was beating fast, both fearful and excited. She told herself that this would be the last time, that after this time she would not see Mr. Archer again. But deep down, she knew that was just a lie. The red sunlight gradually faded behind the bamboo hedge, leaving a space as dim as morning mist. The small hut hidden behind the banana bushes seemed to be waiting for a date between the two. Mr. Archer sat on the old bamboo bed, holding a pipe in his hand, occasionally bringing it to his mouth to take a puff. He was waiting for Mrs. Ariana, the woman he had once loved and still longed for. His heart was broken because seeing her was what he wanted most, but it was also what made his heart ache. When the door of the hut gently opened, he turned around. The flickering oil lamp lighted up her thin aubaba, imprinted on the undulating hills and mountains, inviting. Mrs. Ariana, entering, brought with her the coolness of the evening wind and the faint scent of her hair, like memories of their younger days, when they had each other in their hearts but could not be together because of the distance between their families. Mrs. Ariana, hesitantly standing before him, her deep eyes looked straight at him, as if searching for something long lost. Mr. Archer also looked at her. Those eyes were no longer as clear as when he was young, but still filled with feelings that had been compressed for many years, feelings that time could not erase. "You're here," he said softly, his voice breaking in his breath. Mrs. Ariana did not answer. Just gently sitting down next to him, the small distance between the two of them seemed to contain all the pain they had experienced over the long years behind. She placed her hand lightly on his. The touch made him shiver. He held her hand tightly, feeling like he was holding on to something extremely precious, afraid that if he let go, he would lose her. "Are you still waiting for me?" Mrs. Ariana whispered, her voice broken, as if afraid that the words would disappear in the silence. "Of course," he replied, his voice full of eagerness. He pulled her into his arms and she did not resist. They hugged each other tightly, exchanging passionate kisses, as if two people who had been lost for so long and had just found familiar warmth again. He placed a kiss on her forehead, inhaling deeply to retain her scent, the scent he had dreamed of on long, lonely nights. Then he leaned down, his lips finding hers, the lips that had belonged to him in his restless dreams. The kiss was gentle but full of longing, as if the two of them were trying to make up for all the lost days. Mrs. Ariana's lips, soft, carried a sweet aftertaste mixed with bitterness. She responded to him without inhibition, as if she could. Time had erased all the barriers between them. Mr. Archer's hand slowly moved down to her waist, feeling the familiar curve that he had longed to touch. Mrs. Ariana shivered, not from the cold, but from the man's tantalizing closeness. She thought of the nights when Mr. Archer could no longer restrain himself. He took her wrist, pulling her to him, strong but not rough. His breath was warm in her ear. His lips found hers again, pressed firmly against hers in a passionate kiss, no longer gentle. The kiss seemed to tear apart all the distance, all the longing that had been stored up for so long. Mrs. Ariana answered him with a passionate response, her arms wrapped around his neck, clinging as if afraid that if she let go, everything would disappear. They kissed when both of them could no longer control themselves. Her lips were soft, sweet, but also full of violence, making Mr. Archer feel like he was lost in a trance, unable to escape. He slipped his hand under her shirt, feeling the soft skin underneath. His calloused fingers slid over every curve, caressing every muscle as if to feel it all. Mrs. Ariana, sitting with her head tilted back, eyes half closed as he kissed along her neck, his hand moved lower, making her unable to resist and let out small, inviting sounds. He pulled her shirt off, revealing her white back under the pale yellow light of the oil lamp. Mrs. Ariana, no longer resisting, her hands also found his shirt, pulling hard until it fell to the floor, revealing his muscular body, although stained with time. Their two bodies touched each other, each breath, each heartbeat seemed to blend into one. Mr. Archer's hands slid gently, exploring every fertile land on her body. His kisses were no longer gentle, but became bold, possessive. "Don't stop," she breathed softly, her lips parted, her eyes sparkling, ignoring everything around her. Mr. Archer lifted her up, placing her on the old bamboo bed. The bamboo hammock creaked under the weight of two people. Mrs. Ariana, lying there, her body glistening under the light of the oil lamp, her eyes dazed, her lips parted, awaiting each kiss, each movement of Mr. Archer. The two people's rapid breathing mixed with the silence, making the small hut seem like a private world of the two of them, a place where there was nothing but the sublimation of emotions. Every touch of his made Mrs. Ariana feel like she was lost in an endless fairyland. His hot kisses, his dry hands awakened in her all the emotions that she thought she had forgotten long ago. After more than 2 hours, when the two became one, the climax was finally pushed to its peak. The strong and sliding feeling made them both disappear into each other, the sound of the wind blowing, the whispering, the chirping of insects, all blended into a passionate melody. There was nothing outside of them, no past, no future, only the present where they found each other. Love in a way that is hard to put into words. Outside the moonlit sky, the wind still blew gently, carrying the scent of the night and the faint scent of young rice. But in the small hut, time kept repeating itself. Mr. Archer and Mrs. Ariana, no longer two lonely people lost in life, but two souls who had found each other. And when the night passed, they lay there in each other's arms, exhausted but content. Mrs. Ariana, her head resting on his, her eyes half closed, her lips smiling slightly. "How nice it would be if we could stay together like this forever," she whispered, her voice like a breeze. Mr. Archer just kept quiet, not needing to say another word. That night, in the small hut by the pond, they belonged to each other in the way they should have belonged a long time ago. No more barriers, no more regrets. After both of them had satisfied their desires, Mrs. Ariana adjusted her wrinkled dress. Her heart was still pounding after the hasty lovemaking in the small hut. The sky was starting to get dark. The fields were immersed in the pale grey of the sunset. She glanced back, where Mr. Archer was still leaning against the doorframe, smiling his familiar, ambiguous smile. She pursed her lips, turned around and walked home. Her heart was as confused as the cold wind blowing on her face. When she got home, the space was eerily quiet. Mr. Anthony's weak, wheezing breath echoed from the inner room. Mrs. Ariana walked slowly into the kitchen, washed her hands under the cold water tap, trying to wash away the wrong feeling that clung to her skin. Mr. Archer's body odour still lingered somewhere, making her feel like a thief, having just stolen something that did not belong to her. She quietly walked into her husband's room. Mr. Anthony was still lying motionless. His eyes were hazy but seemed to be staring at her. Mrs. Anthony's heart sank. "I'm home," she whispered, her voice lost in the darkness, both a report and an apology that she knew would never be forgiven. Then she sat down, gently holding her husband's thin hand, as if to cling to the last bit of peace amid the surging waves in her heart. But that peace, she knew clearly, was an illusion. Even though the fun in the hut by the fish pond had ended, the passion between Mr. Archer and Mrs. Ariana still smouldered. They continued to meet secretly, each time more deeply and passionately. Hugs and hasty kisses became a habit that could not be broken, even though both knew the price they had to pay. But the more she threw herself into Mr. Archer's arms, the more Mrs. Ariana was tormented internally. Every time she returned home, looking at her husband lying in bed and the cold eyes of her children, she felt like a traitor, unworthy of forgiveness. The feeling of guilt haunted her every moment of sleep. Even though she knew that these meetings would lead nowhere, Ariana could not stop. Every time she met Mr. Archer, she found a momentary pleasure. But immediately after that, there was a constant gnawing regret. She was caught between two worlds, one of responsibility and duty, the other of passion and desire to be loved. She understood that she could never escape this trap, not because anyone forced her, but because she herself had tied herself to those brief moments. And so her life continued in constant torment, in long, sleepless nights, and in the faint hope of a day of forgiveness, although she knew that perhaps that day would never come. No matter how long life lasted, she just enjoyed it as it came. Our story today will stop here. Thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video. Hopefully the details and emotions in the story have brought you interesting and meaningful moments. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below the video to let me know your opinion. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories in the future. Each of your subscribe buttons and a like will be the motivation for Jane and the program production team to create more attractive videos. And now see you in the next videos. Wish you a great day.